I thought this was all a dream. I wish it was.
All right. Too dark, too dark. No, wrong. All right. Let's get started. Okay. So, I don't think there's anything major to announce. I will say, again, if you're, we're coming to the end of the term. I know it's a stressful time. I'm going to try to get through as like this content, which is our last topic. Woo! Do you want a depressing thought for me, not for you? You are all done with Intro to Social Methods, and you never have to think about it again after this course. I am teaching it again starting in January, so I get to go back to the beginning and do this all over again. So if you're like, wow, this is a really boring class, I'm sorry, I tried. Also, I get to do it again, and probably again next fall. So you got to live through it once. I apparently, this is Sisyphus, right? Pushing the rock up the hill, only to have the rock roll back down, and you have to start again. So that's my life. Same thing with SOS 100. I'm like finishing SOS 100, and I'm like, oh, good, I get a 2-week break. After which I get to teach it again. But I'm switching the topics. I've decided to shuffle. Winter and fall are going to be different somewhat. Okay, so let's talk some. All right, before that, any questions about the assignment? I know we talked about the assignment in a lot of detail last time. Kristen, I know I haven't answered your email from yesterday. I got it. It's
I didn't raise my hand.
No. I know you want to talk about your project. You can come talk to me after class and we can set a time. I just haven't honestly had a chance to answer your email. I just didn't want you to feel like I'm ignoring you, which I might have been, but no longer. But any questions about? Yeah, please, Michaela.
So for the question 6 with the incorporating the quantitative part, like how in depth do you want us to go with that?
I want you to write another quantitative research proposal the same length as last. No, just like what it would be. So like, what's the approach? Like, are you doing a survey? Maybe give me like an approximate size, of how many people you'd survey, and whether you would do it first or like what's your order, right? Are you going to incorporate it as a pilot thing where you're gonna start with that one to gather data for your qualitative analysis, or are you gonna follow up your qualitative analysis with a quantitative bit? That's it. It shouldn't be too long. Yeah, Chloe.
Are sampling methods for qualitative different than quantitative?
Oh my, yes, they would be. Okay, so if you propose simple random sample, like any kind of random sampling, you will fail that portion of the assignment, right? Because you can't get a representative sample doing qualitative research, right? You could never, interview 4,000 people unless you had a research team of 1,000 people. Plus, like doing the content analysis, like coding it would take all of time. So, I mean, basically, you're going to want to stick to a couple of pretty standard methods. So mostly you're going to do like a convenience sample, right? So why, or some kind of snowball sample, because those are the type, like the types of samples that you're going to be able to get for qualitative, right? Now you want to give me a size, right? Like I'm going to interview 50 people, right? That'd be ambitious, and you're going to, recruit them on Reddit using, witty posters or something, right? Or however you think, you're going to recruit them, or you're going to go and, hang out at the furry convention with a sign that says, I'm a researcher, please come talk to me, kind of a thing, right? Whatever you want to do, but you're going to be talking, convenience or snowball sampling pretty much. Yeah.
What I was thinking.
Yeah. A good question. I mentioned it at one point, but it's easy to miss because it's not as big a component of qualitative work. Anyone else? Yeah.
So it's okay that we have like a smaller sample of people then, like, because I thought we had to use the same like calculation method.
Oh, no.
How am I supposed to interview 450?
It would be like, again, it's doable if you have like a research team of hundreds. But yeah, no, you don't need that big of a sample. Qualitative work, I mean, I would say on average, unless you're talking about a just massive project, you know, and you have $7 million of government funding, you're talking about probably a max of 2025. Because beyond that, even coding that much data as a single researcher is really, really, really challenging. So, yeah.
So you said last time it's like fake, it was to like imagine anything. So for like that part, can it be like, oh, we got the sample because the school board hired me to do this research and
Sure.
like
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'll allow it. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. Imagine impossible research projects. That would never fly. It's all good. Yeah. See? Yeah. I wrote a better song than John Lennon. There we go. I should have been a Beatle. All right. Are we any other questions? We'll start, and I'll probably give you time today, end a little bit early, and I will say, hey, you can fill out the spot, because apparently I have a track record of being terrible at giving students time in class to answer the spot surveys, which apparently, according to my employer, says that I don't show that it's important for students to do so. So at the end of class today, it's like, no, that's not it. I just never have any time. At the end of class, I'll give you like 10, 15 minutes to do the spot. We will definitely be done everything by Tuesday. So certainly next Thursday, there will be no official class. We'll announce everything and stuff. All right, let's go. I think. All right, so this technically really should have come before mixed methods. That would have made a lot more sense, but I wanted you to have the mixed method stuff for the lab yesterday and tra-la-la-la. Okay, so let's jump in. Yeah, so qualitative data analysis obviously is going to be a little bit different than quantitative, right? When quantitative, you're running statistics, testing hypotheses, like, you know, seeing if there's a correlation between your independent and dependent variables and blah, blah, blah. Let's not relive that part of the course. Qualitative is a little bit different. Okay, so there's two basic operations that you do in qualitative data analysis. The first one, and especially if you're working with interview data, coding and narrative analysis are the two big kind of systematic ones that we can talk about when we're talking about qualitative data analysis, right? General strategies. Now, of course, there's other ways of doing this in terms of how you can approach qualitative data. Like when I did all my content analysis, I didn't really do analytic induction or grounded theory. I didn't really have a methodology. But these are two really common ones for kind of general strategies for qualitative data analysis that you would see typically. All right. Analytic induction. So analytic induction, basically, okay, so yeah, just starting. Qualitative analysis generally is thought of as an iterative process, right? And it's less, I think, direct and straightforward than sometimes quantitative is, because it kind of goes back and forth, right? You kind of go, you collect data, you start your analysis after you have some data, and then you come up with what you think is an explanation for that data, go gather more data, and kind of do this sort of two-step, right? Until you kind of run out of, new information. Okay, so analytic induction, basically looks like this. You have a general research question, some data are gathered, a hypothesis is proposed. If you have an inconsistent case, right? So if you find something in the data, right, one particular person is giving you a different explanation for a phenomena than someone else, you basically, either the hypothesis is redefined to exclude that one case, or the hypothesis is dropped and fundamentally reworked, right? So you can just drop, outliers as outliers, right? You can say, well, okay, in most cases this is true. You can do what Christian Smith does, and it's like, in a minority of cases we found this, but for the most part this hypothesis holds true. Or you can you can drop the hypothesis altogether, or fundamentally revise it so that it then includes that those cases that didn't fit your general hypothesis. And generally, an analytic induction continues until to gather data until no contradictory cases are found, right? So you keep this process up, you revise your hypothesis, revise. Often, what ends up happening is you're making it broader and broader over time until no more contradictions are found. Yeah. Analytic induction as a strategy, because you're really supposed to explain all of the cases, you might end up generating, hypotheses that are so broad that they're not terribly useful. So, sometimes, as you broaden out to try and include every possible case, the theory just gets diluted, right? And so then your explanatory power, or often how interesting the research ends up being, can be fundamentally kind of undermined, right? And that ends up being a problem more on the reporting stage, right? So when you want to go and publish your dissertation or your book, or publish in a journal, it might just be, and sometimes I read research that's like this, and it's just like, yeah, duh, like obviously that's the case, because suddenly, right, it's the hypothesis is so general and in my mind so uninteresting, that it's sort of like now reduced to the level of common sense. And I mean, I saw a research presentation just the other day that was like this, talking about what was it? Prosecution for services they were talking about, where basically, talking about how prosecutors sometimes use charging as a way of getting people into some kind of program. And I was like, okay, yes, no shit. Sorry, excuse my language. I think that is well understood in the literature. Your research is now boring. And it was just such a broad, like, sometimes, sometimes court actions or prosecutor actions are for this. And it's like, yeah, no, of course it is. Like, that's dumb. And I felt bad because, no, I didn't feel bad. I felt grumpy because I had to sit through an hour-long presentation. Different feeling. Okay, I felt kind of bad for mocking the person's thesis, but whatever, all good. Okay, the other problem with analytic induction, genuinely, there are really no guidelines on how many, and this is why I think quantitative researchers look at qualitative research and often are like, this is not rigorous enough, right? This is a problem. There's no guideline, right? There's no sense of how many cases you have to review before you can say that your hypothesis is valid. It's just a relatively broad sense of no contradictory cases, right? So, if you do, this question, how many interviews should you do? Well, if I did 9, is that enough? You can't see my 9, and it makes me sad. All right. 9. Is that enough? Well, I mean, in this kind of framework, theoretically, right, if those 9 people are all telling you roughly the same thing, if you're getting roughly the same information, there's no reason, from an analytic induction point of view that it couldn't. Would 5 be enough? Maybe. You could make a case for it in analytic induction. What's the upper bound, right? What about 100? Do you need to get 100? There's no real guidelines. So there's kind of 2 problems that can occur. Researchers, especially junior researchers, master's students and PhD students, will sometimes go with the low bound, which can get you into trouble. Then people will think your research isn't rigorous enough. I've also seen the other problem, this more with PhD students and people, looking for books. You go too many, right? I've seen people, at a PhD level, and they've got 100 or 120 interviews, and then they're struggling with the data, right? They can't feasibly sort of comprehend all of the interview data they have. And they went and they spent 2.5 years doing interviews with people. And it's like, because it wasn't like, oh, what looks like a good kind of, now this is rare. I mean, I know one grad student who did this, took 11 years to graduate from their PhD. So while the rest of us were off living our lives and getting jobs, they were still paying tuition and growing increasingly bitter. But, and I'll say this, they had a really bad supervisor who should have known better and said, stop, you've done enough, right? But some supervisors are good, some supervisors are not. So those are zeros, not sixes, by the way. Because there's no guidelines in kind of analytic induction, you have to be really discerning in your judgment and figure out like what is enough. And that can be hard, right? Because sometimes it's hard to know. Yeah, please.
Does that mean that like any of the findings really won't be generalizable then to other populations? It's just kind of good information?
With qualitative research, it's really difficult to generalize, right? Because you'll never get a representative sample, right? Because, I mean, in order to get like a representative sample, you have to like be selecting from particular categories, right? Making sure that your ages, your genders, your, racial groups, your income brackets are all like balanced. And, on a it might be theoretically doable. On a practical level, you then also have to get people from all of those groups to agree to talk to you, which is just, it's not doable, right? Like you're never going to have it perfect. And because you're not dealing with statistics, you can't do any of the fancy stuff where it's like, oh, we controlled for some of the skew in our data, right? Because you don't have enough data. Yeah, please.
So just kind of like the diluted, I'm just kind of wondering, like, is there kind of like a middle point between not having contradictory cases and then being diluted? Or is it more so by not having contradictory cases, it is diluted?
So the problem is that every project is different, right? And it depends on the phenomena that you're looking at, the kind of group you're, like some groups are going to be super like if we went and interviewed Mormons, right? Because they're kind of unified from an ideological perspective and it's a very cohesive culture, I would say like you could probably get away with 20 interviews, right? You get saturation probably before you even get there, because you're dealing with a really homogenous, it's not a lot of black Mormons or gay Mormons, right? For whatever reason. I'm sure they're there, but they also get kicked out. So because it's so homogenous, you're going to exclude contradictory cases really quickly. The more heterogeneous a group is, the harder it's going to be to edge out those kind of outliers, right? And then, you're going to end up with, because the group itself is heterogeneous, your hypothesis ends up being like massive and kind of useless. So it depends on I don't say useless, but useless. So it really depends on the group you're talking about. In some cases, right, you might reach that saturation and not have kind of diluted results, but that's going to be more true the more homogeneous your population is. The more heterogeneous it is, the harder that task is going to be, right? So if, I don't know, what would be a really heterogeneous group, like university students, right? You start trying to explain out all of the outliers in university students, but because university students, right, you have political conservatives, liberals, LGBTQ, cisgender, straight, like, because, white, black, indigenous, Asian, like you have such a heterogeneous population, it's going to be much more complicated, I think. Does that answer your question? So the rule is pick a homogeneous population. It makes life much easier. But, I mean, it's also not going to be as interesting, right? Because there's going to be less to say other than they're like, they move like sheep, right? Right? It's just say Mormon or I've said so many mean things about Mormons this term. It's just, I am sorry, teaching sociology of religion. They're a great example, but I end up saying mean things about Mormons and things that I'm sure if I was a Mormon would get me excommunicated. It's a good thing I'm not. Okay. Other questions? All right. We tired of my doodles? You should see my sheep doodle. It's very bad. It's a cloud with 4 sticks on the bottom. Okay, grounded theory. I mean, grounded theory and analytic induction are very, very similar. Um, they're both iterative processes, right? They're grounded theory is also inductive, right? Because it's, it proceeds from data to hypothesis and not the other way around. Okay, so, this is Strauss and Corbin's, theory from 1998. Basically your grounded theory that was derived from data systematically gathered and analyzed through the research project. This is the most widely used framework in analyzing qualitative data. I should shut off the mic for this portion, but I won't. There's a reason it's the most used. And it's pretty straightforward, honestly. Almost everybody will say they're doing a grounded theory approach because no one really questions it, right? If you say you're doing grounded theory, you cite Strauss and Corbin, and you describe your methodology as kind of inductive, and you're going to gather your data and then analyze and gather more data, boom. In your candidacy exam, the thing that allows you to go on and do your research in a PhD program, you're done, right? Use the grounded theory approach. No one even questions it because so much of kind of qual work is grounded theory. Ooh, a video. I think this one is funny. I think it's funny. You'll have to tell me.
Okay, team.
Oh, good. There's sound. The room I have SOS 100 in, something is broken and I cannot get sound to work. And I'm like, is it my computer? But there it's not.
Everything that's going on with the coronavirus right now, I thought it might be fun if we do a little project together. Okay. This sounds spectacular. You know I'm down, bro. So, I thought what we could do is learn more about grounded theory by interviewing someone to learn what life is like for folks during the pandemic. Grounded theory? What's that? Yo, isn't that a method of qualitative inquiry founded by Glaser and Strauss in 1967 that utilizes a constant comparative method between previous and newly collected data, enabling the researcher to form theories about a phenomenon that are grounded in the data provided by the participants? Yes, that's surprisingly thorough. Are you reading that off somewhere? Anyways, moving on. So the first step of our study is to come up with some research questions. So, what are some things we might want to know regarding our topic of what is life like for folks during the pandemic? What is life like for folks during the pandemic? Yeah, that's pretty solid, actually. Anyone else? Well, I for one think it would be perfectly delightful to know how their life has changed from before the pandemic to now. Oh, dude, you took mine. Perfect. Okay, so we have our two main research questions, right? What is life like for folks during the pandemic, and how has life changed from before the pandemic? Now, how can we go about finding our answers? Oh, Jordan, we ask people. I mean, not wrong. We'll need to come up with some solid questions for the interviews to go along with our research questions. Sometimes these questions will be similar to our research questions, and other times they might probe for more information. Then we'll transcribe the interviews. Then, as we code it, I love secret codes. Great. Now, just to clarify, when I talk about coding is looking through the data for common patterns, themes, or ideas that emerge from the data. That doesn't sound as cool. I hear you, but let's not forget that we are doing this together as a team. Yeah, go team! Huzzah! Oh yay. Like I said, we go through the data individually and we create the codes. Secret codes. No. Can we take that off, please? Thank you. They're just regular codes. So as we're going through this process, we compare the new data we have come across with the codes we're creating and either add more codes or adjust the codes we have. Basically, we look at the data we're collecting, we look at the codes we've already created, and we're constantly comparing that data to our codes. Making changes, adding new ones, taking ones out that don't exactly fit the data we're seeing. So that's that constant comparison method of our theory. Then we all come back together, we talk about codes we found and see if they fit. So we call that triangulation. Yo, 3 sides, right? This is going well. So triangulation is one way we ensure our findings are valid. If we are all coming to the same conclusions, then we can be more certain that our findings are accurate. Usually, grounded theory triangulates using multiple interviews. Once we finalize all our codes, we gather all the data together and present it using direct quotes from the interviews to support our theory. Whoa, so our theory is grounded in the views of the participants. Exactly. Any questions? Yes, Adam, I do have one question really quick. If we're trying to aim for triangulation of data, why are we only interviewing one person? Look, this is supposed to be a short video, and I'm sort of running out of ideas for characters, so can we just get to the interview? Works for me, bro. Who are we interviewing? Wait, is it that? I have never seen this man before in my life. Thanks for agreeing to the interview today. Of course, it's nice to have someone to talk to. Alright, let's see what we've come up with. It looks like one of our main categories was general feelings of anxiety, okay? Under that, we listed a few examples. Let's just see what these are. So there's a mini panic attack you mentioned when he was out of toilet paper. Yo, and that time he almost shaved off all his hair? Classic. YouTubing how to make a face mask with things you have at home. Google searches for, I just coughed, do I have coronavirus? And hours of staring into the existential void. The other codes. It seemed as though he spoke of engaging in lots of different activities to sort of ward off the anxiety, if you know what I mean. So, under my anxiety distractions code, I've got watching all 9 seasons of The Office, cleaning literally everything. Attempting to make sourdough bread. Snacking. Watching all 9 seasons of The Office again. Dude, is this guy alright? It's impossible to know. He is living his absolute best life. Now, is this where we think we should put the parts about making TikToks?
I'm a savage, yeah. Classy, bougie, ratchet.
Yeah, that's where it should go. Alright, well this is great. So what we do now is compile our results to a cohesive theory about what life is like during the pandemic. As we mentioned before, if we wanted to keep building on this theory, we could keep doing interviews and adding to or adjusting our codes as new information rises until nothing new comes up and our data is saturated. I think we need to add another code. There are parts that don't really fit into anxiety or anxiety distractions like this part. Even though this whole thing is really lonely, being in quarantine, it's also made me really appreciate things that I don't think I appreciated as much before. Phone calls or FaceTime with family or friends, playing games over Zoom, or just going to class over Zoom, honestly. Seeing people, hearing conversation, going for walks, feeling the sunshine, just recognizing how much beauty there is around us, things I took for granted before. This pandemic is definitely made me think more about. Dang, yo. That was sentimental.
Okay, so that's hopefully a funny way of thinking about it. Let's not watch that again. Okay. Yeah, so grounded theory, what is in it? Coding, which they talked about. Constant comparison, right? You're constantly, as you go through, comparing your old data and your new data, your codes, checking the codes. The indicators are repeatedly compared for concepts and categories, right? So you're making sure always that your codes are covering everything. If you need to change the codes, alter the way you're coding things a little bit, you do that. And yeah, that last point is theoretical saturation. And that's the point in elite. So this is, I think where grounded theory, is a little bit more helpful than analytic induction. Theoretical saturation is your end point, right? When you're going through interviews or focus groups, or even if you were doing content analysis and you're coding things in content analysis, right? You're reading diaries from the 19th century or whatever. At the point when you stop learning anything new, right? Where you're not adding any new codes, there's no new information or new insights you feel like you're getting, that's kind of when you stop in grounded theory. Again, I feel like in that sense, it's a lot more doable than the very similar kind of approach in analytic induction, but you can just kind of be like, okay, after 25 interviews, it seemed like I wasn't learning anything new, right? People were saying similar things to what the other interviewees or focus groups had said, and therefore I stopped. That was my end point, okay? Does that make sense? All right. Oh, coding. One of my least favorite things. Yeah, so in grounded theory, coding is the labels given to issues, activities being observed, right, or statements that people are making. And you would start this right at the beginning, right? So you do your first interview or your first focus group, you transcribe it right away, and you start building your codes for the project, right? So you have to start this, as early as possible so you can get that continual comparison going on as quickly as possible. So coding is the first step of interpreting the data and developing a theory. And, honestly, like, what you would probably do is you take your first interview, you transcribe it, and then you start building your codes, right? So you're like, okay, what are kind of statements I'm seeing in this interview? What are interesting themes? Build those codes, and kind of go from there. So basically the data, treat it as possible indicators of concepts. So, you're going to build out your kind of hypothesis that's going to deal with, concepts. Is it anxiety and anxiety distraction during COVID, right? Those would be your kind of, your concepts. And then, people saying certain things like, oh yeah, I snacked a lot, or I watched 9 seasons of The Office, or whatever would be your indicators of those concepts. All right. I'm trying to get through this quickly so we can do things. Okay. Types of coding. All right. Open. Identifies initial concepts that will be categorized as close to the data as possible, right? So basically, right, if you're doing kind of open coding, you're basically reading, say, your transcripts or listening to the interviews and identifying, the initial concepts that you'll categorize together later. So, right, you might, I don't know, like, I'm trying to think what it would be, like indicators of loneliness, indicators of anxiety, right? What are your initial concepts that you might group together in a code a little bit later on? Axial coding, right? You review the data for linkages and reorganize according to those connections, right? So what, you're looking for, linkages, like are there's 2 concepts that kind of are linked together, right? And you might merge those codes, create new codes out of that, create codes that kind of double touch on 2 particular things. Selecting core category. I feel like this is the one that I did the most. Selecting core categories that you think, like, what do you think is most important in the data? So you kind of figure out your core categories, things that validate particular relationships. Sometimes it shows gaps, where you're like, oh, there's something unexplained in, between these 2 kind of key ideas that I'm hearing. Like there's maybe a why question that's coming up. So especially, in grounded theory, because you're going to gather more data, you might add in questions to an interview where you're seeing like there's a gap in my data. There's something I'm not asking and information I'm not getting. And then you can start coming up with a theory, right? You conceptualize the beginning of a theory, which you can then test by gathering more data and seeing if your theory is kind of explanatory, right? So, I mean, I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that part of this sort of process is you might be, as you go through, adding questions to, say, your interview guide to get at different pieces of data, different connections that you think maybe you missed in your initial kind of, when you created your interview guide at first. I know, coding is exciting stuff. All right. We'll say this is very much in the weeds, and you don't have to worry about this for your major lab because we're not actually gathering data, but I'll just kind of, we'll just kind of talk about it, right? All right, so you can kind of elements or outcomes of grounded theory, right? You'll come up with some concepts, right? So anxiety reduction behaviors, right? Categories, things that encompass more than 2 things, like loneliness might, involve anxiety, isolation, these sorts of things, right? Could encompass different concepts. Properties, what are the attributes of categories? There are these psychological states, are these outcomes of isolation, anything like that. And then, the key ones is, you come up with a hypothesis, an initial hunch about what the data might mean, which you then test, as you're continuing your grounded theory. Once you have your saturation, right, you'll build your formal theory of what's going on. Yeah, Mia.
Sorry, so the concepts are anxiety reducing behaviors, for example. The categories can be like loneliness, can encompass anxiety, and then what would be the properties?
Oh, I mean, it might be like, the properties, attributes of a category. See, I'm doing this on the fly, and I should have come up with examples beforehand. Attributes of the categories, right? That these are all kind of, things that stem from isolation, right? That these are all, ultimately all of these things are sort of properties of isolation due to COVID, right? Now I'm going off that guy's video, so I'm stealing from him twice. I'm a bad person. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. We can generate from this either substantive theories. Okay, so substantive theories are, observed patterns are related to each other, and a theory is developed to explain the connections in those kind of settings. Right, so what is the, substantive, what is the kind of content of what you're seeing, right? The substance of what you're seeing and how, say, your different concepts or the observed patterns you see are related to each other, right? This is more like related simply to your cases. You can almost think of this as like a middle range type of theory, right? Where you're saying, like, in the cases that I observed, this behavior was explained, by this, right? That when people are, isolated, they act in these ways to manage, the symptoms that come with isolation. In say the case of COVID-19, right? During this period, this is what people did, right? So it's grounded in what you saw only, right? So you're like, in the case of this particular moment in time in society, this is how people manage things. This is the kind of behaviors we saw, and it was because of this. A formal theory, I say typically would be something that would be, if you wanted to explain what isolation and loneliness do to human beings on a grand level, something like, the COVID-19 example that this guy was talking about in his video would be only one part of that. You would have to then, go and look at other settings, right? So you would have to look at, COVID or, isolation in the woods, right? People who get lost and have to deal with loneliness and anxiety, they get lost in the woods and have to survive. I'm just making up things, right? People in prison who get put in solitary confinement, right? And then you could come up with a formal theory of how loneliness affects people. That's kind of like, in a grand scale, I've got all these comparative cases of how people, dealt with loneliness and isolation. And this is what I think it means in terms of kind of general human coping with these, right? So the substantive is the particular of one single sort of case, and the formal would be you take a bunch of different settings and try to create a theory that's broader, right? That's more generalizable. So you can gather qualitative data at all of those sites that are different, that have different kinds of aspects. Now, obviously, most people stick to the substantive because the formal is incredibly difficult to do. I'll put it this way. If you want to talk the formal, this is a career project, right? That you're going to explain, a particular social phenomenon, how people react in this. This is a project that you build out over a career. You probably write multiple books on it. As you do more research over time and in different locations, you can build out a formal theory. But for the most part, like at a, say, master's or PhD level, you're sticking to the level of a substantive theory, right? One that's grounded in one particular case. Does that make sense? You're all just so ready for this to end. No, question. Josie, fire away.
I'm still a bit confused on the distinction between grounded theory and analytic induction.
Okay. It mostly kind of involves the end point. Like, they're both inductive, and I know that makes things a little bit challenging. Where's my analytic induction, right? Basically, it's that kind of endpoint, right? Grounded theory deals more with when you reach saturation, right? When you're like, I'm not hearing anything else. Analytic induction ends when everything is explained by your theory, right? So like when you think you have your theory that explains everything, then you can stop gathering data and checking and revising your theory. In grounded theory, it's like, I'm not hearing anything new. Now I can stop gathering data and then generate my final theory. Does that make sense? Okay. Michaela.
So what's the difference between codes and concepts?
Like literally a code is just something that you're going to, like codes are mostly all concepts, to be honest. Like when you're going through the data, it's just basically a way of labeling statements, right? Especially in interview data or instances that you find, right? So this statement is an instance, code is this statement is an instance of someone talking about anxiety. This is one of people talking about frustration, right? Like, so you can just categorize, and you can be way more specific. These are very broad codes. You can be way more specific with it. Like I've seen people be like, talking about families and they have a code for frustration with sugary cereal ads, right? Like, honestly, like you can get right down to the kind of that like specificity of things. They're talking about like domestic life and families, and it's like 20% of the moms I interviewed said, they were frustrated with how much their kids wanted to eat Fruit Loops, right? Rather than healthy breakfast. So you can get really specific with it.
Concepts kind of feed into developing the codes. So for example, you have this idea of like, oh, this person's really interested in a certain like same job as like stepping stone for the future career. That's like a concept, but you're like, I don't know how to articulate that in my coding. Basically, like, that's the relationship between code.
Yeah, so I mean, there you would create a code that's like, future job prospects could be your code. So every statement that you find in all of your interviews that have to do with future job prospects, you would put it in there, right? And then you can analyze it from, you can analyze subcategories. Like, then is it like anxiety? Is it, what is the opposite of anxiety? Excitement, right? Like they're excited about their future job prospects. Is that good? Kind of.
I don't know if my brain's just too tired.
It's This is the one problem. It's easier to show you if I like had NVivo running and just show you how it works. But then we'd need data to code, right? But basically, you're just kind of trying to put data in groups. Essentially, that's a code, right? So all things that are connected somehow in terms of ideas, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Wait, Chloe.
Yeah.
Are you good or no?
No.
Never.
No. Good.
Never again.
Okay.
After this class.
I have like induction and ground theory. The only difference is one has a saturation point and one it's kind of like you have to go through everything basically.
Yeah, you have to, your theory that you're developing has to explain every single instance of what you're finding.
So it's a little bit more work than ground theory.
Yes, and it's also, it is a lot more work, I think, but there's more revision of your hypothesis as you're going, right? Like, there's like hypothesis, okay, more data to test my hypothesis. Oops, I found an edge case. All right, now I have to create either revise or scrap my hypothesis and start again. All right, now I've got a new hypothesis. I have to go back through all my data, make sure there's no edge cases there, and then maybe do more research to, see if everything is covered again, right? So it can be, again, harder to know the endpoint. Where, grounded theory, it's like, you're going through, you're transcribing, and you're like, I'm not finding any new things that don't fit the categories that I already have. So I'm done. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Josie, you forgot your question.
I was gonna ask if you can have, like, do the categories have to be mutually exclusive, like they everything you want? Or can you like say, well, they mentioned this, but they also mentioned this in like one phrase?
You could code a statement into two codes, right? Like it wouldn't necessarily have to. Like the category, like the code should be mutually exclusive, right? Like they shouldn't overlap each other, but you could put a statement into two different codes because a sentence someone says could represent two different things. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right? So, you shouldn't have like anxiety and anxiousness as categories because then you're going to have, or worry, anxiety and worrying would probably not be good codes to have next to each other. You should have, anxiety and excitement, but something could, Someone could make a statement that fit into 2 codes. Yeah, that's the trick. Okay. Step 1. All right, this steps in analysis. In-grounded theory. Okay, these steps are fun. Research begins with a general research question. Okay, that's step 1, right? So in a lot of ways, you've already... Did I see a hand up, or was that just stretching? Okay. You're like, no, I don't ever want to ask you a question. Please just end this class as soon as possible. I'm imagining that you're much more tired with this class than maybe you are. I'm being over dramatic. Okay, step 1. You can have lots of fun. No, general research question, like in a lot of ways, you've already started this, right? You have general research questions for qualitative. So, step 2, relevant people and or incidents are theoretically sampled, right? So you have a research question, and then you find who you want to talk to. Let's say you're doing interviews because that's the easiest. You figure out who you want to talk to, right? What groups do you want to talk to? What kind of people do you want to talk to? Theoretically sampled, basically, sounds fancy, but you're basically just identifying the groups you want. The groups are people that you think are going to be relevant, right? So you figure out what those groups are. You come up with a sort of plan. Step 3, relevant data are collected. You go and do interviews, right? You go and do focus groups. You basically collect your data. Data 4, you code the data at the level open coding or general concepts, right? So you come up with it here. There's constant movement backward and forward among the first 4 steps. So that early coding suggests the need for new data, which leads to theoretical sampling, right? So maybe here, right, you come up here and you realize, oh, you need to talk to more people, right? You need more information. You need another group. You need, your snowball sampling, right? So it's like, okay, I talked to Jane, and Jane said, oh, you should really talk to my friend Sarah. And you go talk to Sarah, and Sarah says, you need to talk to my friend Tom. And you kind of keep going back and forth, right? So you're here, oh, I identified Tom as an important case that I should talk about. I now collect relevant data. I code the data. I realize that I need to talk to nurses, right? And whatever, it goes back and forth, and you're kind of doing constant comparison. This makes it look almost too linear. As you're kind of, working with this, you're doing, I should go to the next slide. You're doing through constant comparison of indicators and concepts and categories. You're going through this all the time. You're creating more codes, more categories. You're doing more axial kind of coding, right? You generate kind of concepts and categories, and basically, you're trying to fit all the data into these really specific codes, right? So you're building out your code base, constantly comparing the data. As you generate new codes, you're going back and comparing, other older interviews you did, maybe recoding them. It's kind of exhausting. All right. At step 6, you get to categories have been saturated in the course of the coding process, right? You've developed all the codes. You're not finding any new codes. You're not finding any new data in what you're doing, right? So you basically think you have enough. You think you've understood everything. Relationship between the categories are explored in such a way that a hypothesis about the connections of the categories emerge, right? So you come up with your hypothesis at step 7A, right? So you think you've explored everything you in your kind of initial data gathering, and it's like, great, I think I've got it. At step 6, right? It's crucial to ensure to fit. And then, right, you might go back to theoretical sampling, right? It might be like, okay, I have my hypothesis. Now I want to test my hypothesis by gathering more data to see if any new information emerges. You collect more data, you do the same things, right? You saturate your categories. You're like, no, I think I got everything. I've reached saturation. I understand. And then you can develop a substantive theory, right? If you've tested your hypothesis, everything works out. You can develop your theory of that particular case or concept. And at step 12, right, you might go to other settings, right? You collection analysis of data in other settings. It's like, all right, I got a bunch of people who were isolated during COVID. Now I'm going to go talk to people who have experienced isolation in prison, right? And then once you've done that in a few settings, you can develop your formal theory. Again, this makes it look much more this looks really complicated. Sometimes things don't look good in the form of a graphic. I will say that this is much more intuitive than it looks like, right? It's like, this makes it sound really clunky. Grounded theory is actually pretty elegant and straightforward, even though this makes it seem like this would be a giant pain in the ass to do. It's actually just, right? You gather data, you code it, you come up with concepts, you keep gathering data, you run out of things that you're finding out, you create a hypothesis, maybe you go collect some more data to test it. If it all kind of is working out, you create a theory, right? And then if you want to test that theory in another setting, you go and you gather data in that setting. And then you see if you find other things, right? And then you can come up with a formal theory. There you go. It sounds really clunky, but it's actually pretty straightforward. Right, I already talked about these. Never mind. Step 12. Okay, I had more slides, but I'm just going to skip them. All right. Again, all these steps, it sounds really clunky, but never, ever have I seen someone or a supervisor or anyone doing research being like step 1, step 2, step 3 as like a checklist of things you have to do. We all kind of understand what grounded theory looks like, right? And you're going to say to your committee or to yourself, if you're a PhD and you're doing your own research project, like, okay, where am I at in this process? Do I need more data? It's not going to be like, I am now at step 12. Have I completed step 12? No, it's much more organic than this. And sometimes when we talk about it and try to formalize it, it looks really clunky, but this is actually a really intuitive process. I will just say that. Okay. Memos in grounded theory. Sometimes, people are like, when you're coding data, you might put little notes in your kind of transcripts or in your codes. There are reminders about, what you're thinking, reminders about what's meant by the terms used, right? So, like, if you want like little reminders of what this particular code means, or even like in the data you're gathering, you might find, people using certain terminology, especially in kind of really unique social circumstances. You can like leave little memos for what particular terms mean. Memos are just important, right? One of the things that memos will tend to do is kind of anchor you as close to the data and your initial impressions of it as possible, right? Sometimes people will put these kinds of memos that are like, I think this idea is related to this concept, right? And this is like my initial theory about how these two things are related, right? So sometimes people, like NVivo is really good for this as a program. You can put like notes and you can like select two concepts and be like, hey, I think these are how these two concepts are related, right? So people put little memos in as they're going along. Useful in that you wouldn't lose things that you're thinking, because sometimes, you just kind of forget the ideas that you have. Okay. Okay. Criticisms of grounded theory. Yeah, some of the terminology. Oops. Right, I'm writing in white. That's why I can't see anything. Sometimes differences between concepts and categories might be vague, right? These terms are all a little squishy. And defining, what's a concept, what's a category, can be a little bit difficult. Observation and data gathering might not be as theory neutral as claimed, right? So the idea behind grounded theory, right, is that you gather data and then you produce a theory. Does that actually happen? Right? Does that actually happen? Do people actually go into a research process with no thought of what they're going to find in the data? Or do people, I guess the danger is, if you have a sort of unstated hypothesis and you say you're doing grounded theory, is what you're doing actually, more or less a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I wanted to find, you know, a certain piece of information about the furries, right? I think furries are sexual deviants, but I didn't want to say that in my research proposal. So I said I was doing grounded theory, but as I'm interviewing and coding things, I already had that hypothesis in mind. So I kind of proved my own theory. Was my process actually theory neutral? And I think it's hard, right? Everybody, I think, has a pre-existing conception of what they're going to find in data. Now, I mean, you can be flexible and overcome your own, kind of preconceptions, but, it can be a problem, right? Are you as theory neutral as you claim to be? Probably not. Practical difficulties. What happens if you haven't reached saturation, but you have reached the point where people don't want to talk to you anymore, right? No, I mean that seriously, right? Like, one of the things, like, say you're doing a snowball sample, how to put this? Let's say the snowball metaphor. And at some point, the snowball hits the bottom of the hill, right? Now, there might be more snow to gather. This is a terrible metaphor. What have I done? There's more snow to be gathered, but the thing isn't rolling anymore, right? Your last 5 interviews, they're like, yeah, I don't know anybody else you could talk to. And you just run out of cases, right? And you're having trouble recruiting people. Nobody else wants to talk to you. You can't, your ability to network and get more information has just run aground, right? And so you're like, you haven't really, because every single interview we're still getting new information, but you're out, people won't cooperate with you anymore. And that happens, right? So then, your grounded theory process is sort of stuck, and you have to make a decision like, what do I do? Do I just stop? Do I keep trying? There are lots of practical difficulties. Access to groups and spaces might prove harder than you think, right? Especially if you're talking about sensitive issues, whatever it happens to be. Okay. It might not result in a formal theory, right? Especially, substantive is a little bit easier. Formal theories are rare. I think, like I said, formal theory is like a career project, I think, for the most part. But what if, you can't make sense of the data? What if the data, human beings don't always fit into little neat categories? What if you can't make sense of the data? What if there's no hypothesis that explains this particular phenomenon? Have you failed in your grounded theory? Is your grounded theory a big flop? That's a danger. And coding, right? Coding can result in fragmentation, loss of narrative flow. By breaking things down into these really discrete categories of statements, right, it can start to become hard to remember or figure out what the overall story of the data is, right? Now, this isn't necessarily the biggest problem, except that one of the jobs of a researcher is storytelling, right? Is to tell the story of your data. But if you have just these like random data points that aren't really telling you anything, right? It's like, oh, I have these things, anxiety, I have isolation, I have Cheeto addiction, right? I have, long walks in the park with my dog, right? And you're like, I don't know what the story of this data is because you've taken it all apart, right? So you no longer have that narrative flow that people were telling you. It can be a problem with grounded theory. Okay, how are we doing? How am I doing for time? All right. As I said, I promise that I'm going to give you some time to... This ends at 12:20, right? Yes. Okay. How much do I have left? I got coding. Lots of stuff on coding and narrative analysis. Why don't we finish this? I'll give you 20 minutes to do the spot, or whatever you want to do. I don't care. But when you answer the spot, it's like, were you provided in-class time to do this, whether you do it today or never? You should do it, I guess. Tell them how terrible I am so I don't have to teach this class again. No, I'm kidding. That would be not good for me. Just tell them whatever. Tell them whatever you want. I don't care. But yeah, just, answer, yes, I was given time in class to do this. Huzzah, the day is won. And then they can get off my ass with this. Okay, so we'll talk about coding on Tuesday. We'll finish the class on Tuesday. And then labs next week are not labs, but I will have some drop-in time during the 2 lab periods. So Tuesday and Wednesday for you to just come by and talk about your major lab or anything else you want to talk about. Course related, of course. So yeah, you can stop by then. It'll be me, not Celine. And yeah, we'll finish this up easily in about an hour on Tuesday. And then we'll be done Thursday's class. Maybe I'll just come and hang out in the room. And if you want to stop by and ask questions, we can do that too, to make it as flexible for everyone as possible. And we'll call it quits from here. All right. So yes, do the spot whenever you want. And we'll see you on Tuesday.
Hello. I didn't get to go to the lab on Tuesday, so I kind of wrote something up,
Okay.
and I'm not sure if it is on the right track. It probably is not, but
So you're essentially doing a survey as kind of a pilot
yeah.
study for, do you have a thought of how many people?
Did I quit?
You said 20 questions? I don't see a number.
Probably, what is a good amount of people to use? Like 50?
Yeah, for a pilot, you could do 50 to 100. I mean, you won't be able to do any statistical analysis on a sample that small, but it's still workable.
Basically, my idea is that I would pretty much do the sample to see if these people are struggling with a double burden.
Okay.
If so, that would match my hypothesis, and then I can take those questions into like a deeper personal...
And then you build them out into interview questions.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that works.
Okay,
Yeah.
good?
I think so.
Good enough?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
No worries. All right. Sorry, I didn't